hand for Ras Makonnen.
Greetings, family.
Greetings.
I'm first of all just going to give you an introduction into who I am. Some of you will know me from various different places. I will probably come across your paths in different ways. Also, I'd like to hail up all my family members who have made it. My Uncle Junior, Auntie Patsy, Cousin Danielle, Cousin Rian. And Auntie Marilyn. Sorry, Auntie Marilyn. Okay, so myself, Makonnen Sankofa. I'm a Pan-African activist, journalist and member of the Luton Black Men Community Group. So I live in Luton, however I was born in London and I do come to London to community events every now and again, so some of you in the room may be familiar with me or see me. The work that I do in Luton as part of the Luton Black Men Community Group, I'm one of the core foundation members, and we put on events throughout the whole year. So we put on various different events, so it could include film screenings, it could include lectures, seminars about economic empowerment, where we have different people that come up and speak about their business and initiatives that they can get involved in, and also about travelling to Africa, repatriation. Myself, I will be going to Gambia for at least 6 months in July, and I'll be, yes, at least 6 months, and I will be delivering a lecture again next week. Following on from the lecture I delivered a couple of months ago about repatriation and travelling to Africa, one of the 3 guest speakers as part of Africa Repatriation Group UK, which is a network group on social media that I've set up. And as a member of Luton Black Men, we also get involved in various other things in the community. I'm also part of African Heritage Network of Luton, which helps put on Kwanzaa celebration events in Luton and also in London. So African Heritage Network of Luton, we are one of the organisations that form the Kwanzaa Network UK, which put on Kwanzaa events also in London, and we played a big role in the 50th anniversary of Kwanzaa, which took place a few years ago. So that's just a brief idea about who I am. Now, the reason why I read this book, The Rise of Rastafari, now, about 15 minutes ago, I was outside speaking to a Rastafari brethren, or inside, but outside of this room, and he said what inspired me about writing this book. So I spoke with him, or reasoned with him, and I told him what inspired me. So for me, I feel that there's not a lot of places that young people particularly can find out a lot about Rastafari. I think, obviously, based on the contributions that Rastafari has made all over the world, obviously, we look at, say, England in maybe the 70s and the 80s, you can look at in the Caribbean or on the continent itself, that Rastafari doesn't get the recognition that it deserves for the contributions, the positive contributions that it's made towards the African liberation struggle in terms of preserving our culture, heritage, and traditions. So it was very, very important for me that history is still told. I also wanted to highlight some of the founding fathers of the Rastafari movement that are not often spoken about. So people like Leonard Percival Howell, Archibald Dunkley, Joseph the Pivot, and Robert Hanks. So there's some people that have been Rastafarians for 30, 40 years who've never heard of these names. So it's very, very important that these names are remembered and held up. Right. And it's very important as well what Rastafari is understood, because the conception, I said, writing this particularly towards young people of Rastafari is normally, you see someone in trend, you think, Rastaman, yeah? Which is not the case at all, yeah? Or you see someone smoking weed and you say Rasta. I mean, when I went to Gambia, it's like, I remember when I was speaking to my girlfriend at the time, and she was telling me, oh, that person's like you, Rasta. And I was like, what is that? It's like, oh, they have dreadlocks. And I was like, so? Yeah. But, so I wanted to highlight exactly what Rastafari is, yeah. So that leads me on to now explaining what Rastafari is, which I mentioned in the book. And Rastafari is a Pan-African movement based on the upliftment of African people, or black people, whether it's culturally, politically, economically, and spiritually. So, as Rastafarians, myself included, we regard Emperor Haile Selassie I as either an idol, God, or the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, Rastafari is based on the Pan-African teachings of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and Marcus Garvey taught that we as African people, that we should build our own nation, we should be self-sufficient, and we should look towards repatriating to Africa, and really important, we should acknowledge divinity within ourselves as African people. Yeah. So the Rastafari movement began in the 1930s in Jamaica. However, before the 1930s, there were some factors that came into place which influenced it. One particularly is the transatlantic slave trade. So as pretty much I think everyone in this room will know that the people in Jamaica, descendants of slaves taken from Africa, brought into the Caribbean. And during that process, our people in Jamaica lost their culture, their heritage, their religion, their whole identity. And even after slavery, after the physical damage, there was still a lot of mental enslavement in our people. So there was a need for African people to sankofa and look back and fetch and understand from the past, and look back into what was happening in Africa and use it to move forward. There was a need to get back the African mindset and to liberate their minds. So there was many people that was trying to really uplift African people, black people around the world, Pan-Africanists. One that I'll mention, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, is probably the most notable one in the Rastafari movement, and we regard Marcus Garvey as a prophet. Marcus Garvey formed something called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Now, Marcus Garvey's organisation attracted millions of people, not just in the Caribbean, but also on the continent, in Africa, in Europe, so all over the diaspora, in America. And with Marcus Garvey's UNIA, there was various different businesses that they had, whether it was like coffee shops, steam laundry shops. They had a doll factory where they used to produce factory of black dolls. Marcus Garvey also had his own printing company, and he established the Negro World newspaper as well. And he also set up the Black Star Line, which the intention was to repatriate black people back from the diaspora onto the continent of Africa. Now, what was important about Marcus Garvey is he directed African people to look towards Ethiopia or Africa. It's questionable whether some people say maybe he was just talking about Africa because Africa as a whole used to be referred to as Ethiopia, or specifically Ethiopia, but there's no doubt he referred black people, African people, to look to Africa for the crowning of an African king to be the liberator or messiah for black people. So he'd been saying this in various speeches. He used to quote that princes should come out of Egypt, that Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hands unto God. He also wrote a play, produced a play. At the end of the play, there was a crowning of an African king, and it's also claimed that he said the words that you should look towards Africa for your redeemer, or something along those lines. Now, Marcus Garvey used to be obviously talking about the need for us to also see God within our own image, and it states in the philosophy's opinions of Marcus Garvey, he stressed the need that if the white people, they view God within their image, and other people view God in their image, that we as African people, we need to look at God within our image, and that we do have a proud heritage. So then, Emperor Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. Following the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie as Emperor of Ethiopia, you had ones that came about such as Leonard Percival Howell, Archibald Dunkley, Joseph Hibbert and Robert Hines. Now, Leonard Howell was probably the most known or most prominent out of the four. However, all of the other three as well, they were preaching, and they were preaching independently of Howell at the same time. And they basically took on the baton from Garvey and basically pinpointed Haile Selassie as the person that Garvey was speaking about, or the person that we should look to as a liberator in Africa, and he was a king because he was the king that was crowned. Now, Ethiopia is significant, and it was significant then because Ethiopia is a country in Africa that has never been colonized before. Also, at the time, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two African countries that were independent. Liberia had previously been a colony of USA, so it didn't have a monarchy. So Ethiopia was the only African country that had a proper monarchy. And Haile Selassie was the emperor, so he really symbolized African independence. Because this was a time, like during the colonial period, where all the countries in Africa, they were colonized. Yeah, so it's very important, Haile Selassie, in terms of what he represented at the time. Now, going into the 40s, I mentioned earlier, one of the prominent founders of the Rastafari movement, Leonard Howell, he purchased some land, and he built, he purchased some land, and on the land, which was called Pinnacle, there was a community of Rastafarians that lived there. Now, the community of Rastafarians, they were very skilled people, whether it's craftsmen or tradesmen, and they managed to under Howell's leadership, Pinnacle became the most economically self-sufficient community in Jamaica. Yeah. Leonard Howell is also someone, based on obviously the profits that they used to get from Pinnacle, that is known for going around in the streets of Jamaica and giving money to people that were suffering in poverty. Yeah, that's the kind of man that he was. So that's talking about Pinnacle. Now, going into the 50s, there was a number of key things that happened in the 50s. Now, Pinnacle was burnt in the 50s by the government and by the police that were sent by the government, because there was a lot of persecution against Rastas since it started in the 1930s. And Pinnacle was just one of the examples of the persecution that Rastafarians faced. So the government burned the houses of Pinnacle, and that caused a lot of people that was living on that Pinnacle to go into the hills or live in the slums like Bakawal or Kingston and various different places in Jamaica. Now, the 1950s is also significant as well, because in the 1950s, the Kenyans were fighting to get independence from the British. So when the Kenyans were fighting to get independence from the British, they had their hair in dreadlocks. Now, they wear the dreadlocks because they was fighting against a war. So prior to that time, most Rastafarians didn't wear dreadlocks. And the founding father, Leonard Howell, Haile Selassie and Marcus Garvey, the three most important people in Rastafari, do not have dreadlocks. So until the 50s, the dreadlocks weren't as prominent. But then, once they saw the Mau Mau warriors, then more Rastafarians started wearing the dreadlocks. And also, as well, because there are Rastafarians who interpret the Bible, who use the Bible as a reference, and in the Bible, they follow the Nazarite vow. So that's really how the dreadlocks came about. Also, in going into the 50s, you had the Bob Ashanti that was formed, which is another Rastafarian group. Prior to that, you had the Nyabingi and the Howellites, who were the original Rastafarians, but the Bob Ashanti, which was formed by Charles Emmanuel Edwards, that happened as well. Going into the 60s now, so there were significant events. So Jamaica became independent in 1962, but then a year later, you had the Coral Gardens Massacre. Now, as I mentioned earlier about how Rastas were persecuted, Pinnacle was one example. Then you also had Coral Gardens as another example. And Coral Gardens, that was an incident that took place in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Following the incident, the Prime Minister at the time, Alexander Bustamante, he made all Rastas villains, and he said basically to bring him in dead or alive. Now, when he said bring him in dead or alive, he was saying to bring him in prison, dead or alive, and if the prison can't hold him, then throw them on Bogle, which is a cemetery in Jamaica. So he sent out a verdict to get rid of Rastafarians in Jamaica because of an incident that happened, and also putting into context Rastafarians, in terms of what they represented. Basically, the government didn't like it because Rastafarians was very against colonialism, very anti-systematic, and obviously again, Britain coming out of colonialism, Britain had colonized Jamaica for the last 400 years, and until 1962, as I said, Jamaica was still a British colony. And even just go walking around in for example, the streets, Rastafarians, they would get their dreadlocks cut off, and they used to have to go walk in gullies, and then that led to a lot of Rastafarians going to live in secluded areas in the hills of Jamaica. As they started to live in secluded areas of the hills of Jamaica, then they started farming and growing their own food. So that's when the ITOL came into this. So they started growing, farming their own food, and then eating natural food from the earth. Also, in terms of the 1960s, not only did you have obviously the Jamaican independence, You had the Coral Gardens incident. You also had 12 Tribes of Israel, which was formed, which is another Rastafarian organisation as well. Now we're going into the 70s. In the 70s, Rastafari was very important in terms of his influence on reggae music. So a lot of Rastafarians, they would sing about reggae music, in the reggae songs, you'd hear like a lot of Rastafarian themes. So you had people like, whether it's Bob Marley, Birmingham Spear, Gregory Isaacs, Peter Tosh, Freddie McGregor. Probably the biggest one that popularised Rastafari around the world was Bob Marley. Bob Marley had a lot of Rastafari themes in his songs, like whether it was Selassie, is his Chapel, Rastaman Chant, Babylon System, and various other African Unite and various other songs. Peter Tosh, I think, embodied Rastafari when he, in one of his songs, when he says, no matter where you come from, you have the identity of an African. And as Rastafarians, we've always fought to be, for black people to be identified as African, and we say that we are unapologetically African. So I think that also embodied a big part of what Rastafari represents. And reggae music, I mean, going into the 70s, 80s was very, very popular. Now, Rastafari as well was also very, very important, as I mentioned right at the start of my presentation, for people that lived in England in the 70s and the 80s, because there was a lot of racial persecution that was happening at the time. So Rastafari really helped to keep a lot of the communities together, and it was really the cornerstone in terms of consciousness of what was happening at the time. And it's kind of ironic that, in a way, that as black or African consciousness has kind of drifted, and they'll say there's less cohesion in the community now than there may have been 70, 80 years ago, how Rastafari is less popular now, and how consciousness has gone down. So I think there's definitely a parallel between the two of them. Yeah. And even if we look at, for example, cricket now, in the 1980 to 1995, the West Indies cricket team went 15 years where they hadn't lost a test cricket match. Now, the captain of the West Indies cricket team was Viv Richards, who's called a Master Blaster. And Viv Richards, in his autobiography, says he identifies with Rastafari. When he used to come out to bat, he used to actually have the red, gold, green colours. Yeah. And he was inspired by Rastafari. And that is one of the greatest cricket batsmen or cricketers that's ever been on the field of cricket. Yeah. So these are just some things, some positive contributions that Rastafari has made as well. Now, you may be asking, obviously, where's Rasta gone now? Because obviously that was possibly the past where it is today. That's all why, obviously, stuff like this book is very, very relevant. Because I said before, not a lot of people understand the theology behind Rastafari, so educating them. And whether you're a Rastafarian or not, this book is for everyone. So you don't have to be a Rastafarian to read the book, and you don't have to be a Rastafarian to respect that the contributions that Rastafari has made, whether it's in England, in Africa, or in the Caribbean, in preserving African heritage, African culture. I was talking to a brother earlier, Ras Kwende. I'd just like to hail him up because he's also got a book on Rastafari. And even something like he was stressing the importance of dreadlocks, of it being obviously your natural state of hair in an African form. Just using that as an example, whether it was in Zimbabwe when they were fighting to get independence, the influence that the Rasta music had on helping the soldiers fight for independence, and there's just so much contributions. And I'm thinking, even at I'm 28 now, when I came into, I would say, consciousness when I was probably 20, maybe 21, and even up to this point, any time that I go and speak to a Rastafarian or a reasonable Rastafarian, particularly back then, I would always get a lot of love from Rastafarians. I always get, for example, always positive vibes. It always makes me feel better after I have a conversation with a Rastafarian. So that's just the kind of support and the energy and the love that Rastafari represents. And Rastafari is a movement, and it's about love. It's about love to African people, loving your African brother, loving your African sister, loving being African. And that's what Rastafari represents, and that's why I think it's very, very important that books like this, for example, spread that information and that they continue on to the next generation, and the next generation can really pick up the baton and still really keep spreading Rastafari, because it's a part of our legacy that definitely needs to continue, and it's still very much relevant today, because we are still, as we know, we are still a lot of free people today.
Right.
So we are still having to go to other people, whether it's for, we're still shopping at other people's businesses. In England, we don't have any power. When we look at, for example, the military, whether it's Prime Minister, you don't see black people in positions of power in England. So we still need to be liberated, many of us, not just physically, mentally. Even on the African continent, there's very much Africans that are, when they come here or over there, that are still very much got a colonial mentality. So Rastafari will always be relevant until really, realistically, we're free people. Yeah. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say thank you all for listening to me. And I would like you to all, if possible, purchase a copy of my book, The Rise of Rastafari. It's taken me 5-6 years to write this book. So a lot of research has gone into it, whether it's books, documentaries, speaking to Rastafarians, going to events, talking about Rastafari when I've been in Africa, Jamaica, England, and seen Rastafari in different elements as well. Because I'm someone who's travelled, so I've lived in London, Southampton, Luton, Bedford. I've been to Africa, I've been to the Caribbean, and I've mingled in different communities and different places. So I've seen not just Rasta, but I've seen a lot of the world in general, different aspects, and I've seen Rasta in different environments. And I just wanted again to stress the importance of the book. And I hope you all come out and support me and spread the Black Pound. Now, I'm just going to speak now a bit about the process of publishing the book now. So I am going to be online and on the Kindle very, very shortly. If you can't make a purchase today, please take my details and you can purchase it later. Get in, I just want to hail at my publisher, Winston Duncan. Yeah. And sitting next to my sister, Jet, who's going to be distributing my books. And in terms of the process of publishing, this is how it came about. And I initially had a book launch in Luton. I knew the organizer of the book launch, so she told me about an event she was doing, and I was working on this book, so I was like, okay, I think I'm going to do a book launch at this event. It's about two months away. So I committed to do it at that event, but I probably didn't realise the process of how long it would take me. This book, by the way, I said I worked on it for about 5-6 years. The last year and a half has been just on editing alone. Yeah, that's me revising the book, going back into it, adding bits and expanding it. It's just been on editing it. And as Winston, my publisher, would probably say, I'm a perfectionist, and I always like to make sure that things are done correctly. So I had to work within the last 2 months before this event in Luton. This book launch, which I attended yesterday in Luton, there was a lot of work that was still needed. And at this time, I'm trying to manage a job. The work that I was doing at the time, for example, Virgin Media, I go to different regions, I go to different places. So I live in Luton, I could be in Northampton one day, I could be in Leicester another day, I could have to go up to Norwich, I have to travel up and down the country. So I'm on the road normally, at least an hour to 2 hours a day, out of my house about 12 hours, 10 to 12 hours. So building up to the last 2 months of the event, coming into the event was a lot of work. There was a lot of, for example, time, and some nights I didn't sleep because literally I'm at work and then I've got to finish writing on my book. And the book literally just came to me. I had 2 proof copies, but as I'm a perfectionist, I wanted it to be done again. So literally the book just come on the Wednesday, just in time for the book launches. But there's so much work went into getting it sorted out, and I'd like to thank Auntie Jean, wherever she is as well, for allowing me this platform to have my book launch. I decided I wanted to do a book launch in London as well, because not only do I know a lot of people in Luton, there's also quite a lot of people in London that might not necessarily come up to Luton. But I know that if I did an event in London, they'll definitely like to come down and support. I'd like to hail up brother Olatunji there. I know he's come down and support me. So I decided to do a double book launch, one in Luton and one in London as well. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. If anyone wants to ask me any questions or answers, I'm not going to do a question and answers here. If you come over to my table and you can speak to me and purchase a copy of my book, which most importantly, purchase a copy of my book, and the questions will be in there. Thank you very much.
Great rise up, Makonnen, Psycho for one more time. Again, another champion of our community.